Okay, with that said, so Emmet and Amata, are you ready for me to start to grilling you about agent-based modeling?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah, born ready.
Okay, so I'm going to put the full screen up so you guys appear when you speak. Okay, so first question for you. Could you just give the audience a little untechnical introduction to your background and as it relates to agent-based modeling simulation? And Matt, do you want to go first? So we're not picking on Emirates.
Sure. Um, let's see. So I first started building agent-based models back in 2000 at the Complex System Summer School at the Santa Fe Institute. And then, let's see, that's while I was in law school. Transitioned from law school to becoming an ORSA, an Operations Research Systems Analyst with the Center for Army Analysis, and spent 3 years there uh, building agent-based models and that sort of thing, mostly of a national security flavor. And then from there, joined MITRE in 2004 and have been at MITRE ever since, continuing to build agent-based models all across the federal government topic space, we'll say. And also in that time studied computational social science with uh, Claudio, who has joined us, I see, and also Rob Axtell, getting my PhD in computational social science from George Mason in 2012. And I currently um, am let's see, a principal computational finance scientist and group leader at MITRE, and I lead the generative social science and computational finance group. And now I'm going to clam up and turn things over to Emmet.
Thank you, Matt. Uh, I started in computers back in, I guess, 71. I was actually the first graduate from computer science department at Indiana University. Grew out of the math department. I was in between. I had flown helicopters in the Army, uh, got my degree, got my master's, taught for a year, and then went in the Air Force to fly fighters. And then my last assignment, they sent me to the Pentagon to learn how to be an ORSA. I went through the Army's short course, and back then, simulation was the tool of last resort. If you couldn't figure out any other way to do an analysis, then you were allowed to do a simulation. So I started doing simulations then. That would have been about 89, and eventually came to MITRE in 2003. Found out that I had been doing agent-based simulation, but didn't know that's what it was called. The so at that time, I started doing simulations to do optimization, and it turned out that the Army needed simulations so that the soldiers that were in simulators, and tank simulators specifically, would have something to fight against. And they were called semi-automated forces because they were really dumb, uh, hardly automated at all. And it took an operator to tell them what to do. And if you would tell them to go from here to there, they would go from here to there. And if they got shot at, they didn't care because they were told to go from here to there. So the operator would have to tell them to either go on the defense or attack again. Very dumb. And the Army wanted to make them smarter and have over the years. So I started in that in about uh, 90, 90, well, late 90s, early 2000s, and have been doing, once I found out that what I was really doing was agent-based modeling, trying to figure out how to make all those things get smart and figure out what to do on their own. And then I've been doing that off and on ever since.
Thank you both. So just to, and I know this is a very broad question, and we're not in any ways expecting you to cover the whole of the U.S. Department of Defense, but could you try and give a quick overview of agent-based modeling simulation as it relates to the Department of Defense?
Emmet, did
Well,
you
yeah,
just
I'll do
keep rolling?
that a little bit. And until the last decade or so, I think especially the Army, but the military, the people who were doing it didn't realize that they were doing agent-based modeling. Now we have some in the military that do understand that, who have the training in the background as agent-based modeling has become more common. So they've picked that up. It's really the holy grail for the Army, right? They would like to be able to have a simulation where every entity, every soldier, tank, airplane in the simulation knew what it was supposed to do. It had the rules. I could tell it what the rules of warfare were and give them the tactical manual. And all that was built into them so they could figure out how to coordinate and do the things they needed to do and be completely independent. We're still trying to build that simulation. DARPA takes on a new exercise every decade, I think, trying to create it. We don't have the holodeck quite yet, but that's the goal of it, the long range. More and more, the military agencies responsible for simulation, for analysis of combat, if you will, have picked up on the agent-based idea of being able to reuse them then as the simulations grow and evolve. I can make simulations of ships, fleets, tanks, organizations that I can then move from one simulation to another because I save the objects and they just grow better and better capable, requiring less and less outside guidance on what to do. Military often starts with board games and will make up a game for a situation, use that to do their analysis where they bring in live people. And then if it's something that's of importance or lasting, they'll consider turning it into a computer simulation. So maybe that's a general background. Matt?
So I came onto the scene later. So it was, 2000, 2001. And so from my perspective, I came in as sort of, I would say that the military was transitioning from entity-based to more agent-based. And I make that distinction moving from, as Emmet said, very, very just sort of, puppets, kind of things where they're just told from go to point A to point B and they don't worry about anything that happens on the way, to something where they have a little bit more agency, where they may on their own, oh, I've been shot at, I should now, I don't know, defend, figure out what's going on, and then try to attack, something like that, on my way from point A to point B. And so, from my perspective, back in the late 90s, you've got, Andy Lachinsky at CNA doing a lot of work in, kind of the cellular automata space and trying to transition that into an agent-based model of combat that I think became Isaac. And then you've got actually Congress funding an effort, Project Albert, which was about trying to use simple agent-based models to analyze combat, and more focused on just sort of the mechanics of how do we do that? How do we build the simulation so that it can be manipulated quickly and easily and run very fast? How do we set up an infrastructure for high performance computing to then run it a lot? And actually, it wasn't just the U.S. military that was in the mix there. There was the New Zealand Defense Technology Agency. They created MANA, Map Aware Non-Uniform Automata, which was sort of the first really easy to use agent-based combat model. The German military got involved, the Swedish military, eventually, the Polish military and Singapore and Australia, they were all in there. And basically it became more widely used, and that's where it transitioned from just the mechanics of trying to use agent-based models in a military context to how do we do it in a rigorous manner that doesn't do too much violence to how the military thinks about, verification, validation, and worse yet, accreditation. So anyway, That was it. I'll clam up. Hit us with more questions.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Emmet. One thing I was held back saying, and I just want to say now, this is recording is going to go onto the web. So just to remind everybody, I think we've got a quorum now of all the people that this is obviously unclassified. I'm a foreign national. This is going to go on the web. So please, especially the audience, I'm not, don't go into things that you probably shouldn't be talking about. Okay. Anyway, just to put that caveat there. So that said, you already hinted. So coming back to the question, so Matt, you hinted at this word accreditation. So we see in a lot of the textbooks, we see the word verification and validation. But if you open up any DoD textbook, you see that magical word accreditation. It sounds like that's something to do with the culture within the DoD. And Emma and Matt, could you comment on that at all? Just give us a bit of an insight.
Sure, I'll take that one because I've been the validation agent on several simulations,
So to speak.
and what I've done by doing that is I make a report, which then I give to the accreditation agent to use and say, this simulation is suitable for this purpose. I want to use it for this. And so the accreditation says this simulation will do that, and I accredit it for the use in whatever it is, the analysis. It comes about for a couple of reasons. One is that you can misuse a simulation very easily. So we want to make sure that we're not using a simulation inappropriately. But the other one is that we have a simulation that we've traditionally used, that we've been using for years perhaps. And the idea is that I trust the results for this purpose I have. It may not be perfect. We may have many known errors, but for the use I'm giving it, it's good for, say, doing relative results. I can say this is better than that and have some confidence in that. I may not be able to get an exact quantification of how good it is, but I can say this solution is better than that solution, and perhaps even say how much better. And so for some purposes, the simulation is good enough to be used for answering that. Sometimes we don't have any other way, and we accredit the sim because one answer is better than no answer. So it could even be as bad as that. But usually it's more than that. We really trust this simulation to give me results I can use to make this decision.
So, do you mind if I ask a follow-up question? So, how would you distinguish that term accreditation from validation? I think it's because of the people involved. Is that some level of it?
Yes, very often the accreditation person is usually the person that is responsible for the analysis or the report. And so you have to convince that person that this simulation will do that. The validation agent is usually someone different and much more technical often. And it's their job to give the report to the accreditation agent so that he has sufficient evidence to say, yes, this is suitable.
Thank you. So, continuing with terminology a bit, I think this is quite an interesting direction. Earlier on, you both mentioned the word entities. That's not a word necessarily commonly used within the more general ABM world. Could you just talk about what an entity is briefly, or why is that used and not the word, I'm guessing, agent, right? So
again, I'll say a little bit about that. It comes historically. So simulations in warfare, if we go back, started off with Lancaster equations, where you had forces. I have a force that I'm describing in some way that's made up of some strength of combat, and these two forces are going to fight each other. And I know something about the ability, and I stick them all the values in there, and so the things that are fighting are forces. Eventually, simulations came down to, well, you can again think of board games where you have units running around. And eventually it got to where, well, I need some simulations of single things. And we ended up calling them entities. It's pretty easy for infantry. An entity is a soldier, uh, but it could also be a weapon system. So I have a mortar crew, and as long as the crew's there, it's a down to a level of that's a single weapon. Or I have a tank which has a crew in it, but I consider the tank a single fighting entity. So I can talk about its mobility and its firepower and its defense as an entity, and I can give numbers to those things. So the Army in particular started talking about entities level simulation as opposed to force level or unit level simulation. And they didn't think of them as agents at all. It was, I need to simulate these entities. I couldn't call them individuals because the tank had more than one individual in it. But it's a single weapon system if you want to think of it that way.
So, leading on from that in some ways, and I think you've already hinted at this, but just clarification in the sense that, you know, the DoD does have its own set of terminology, which seems to be slightly different from what we see in the general world. You know, what's your take on that? Why has that evolved like that, given that the DoD has been so heavily involved in simulation for so many years?
I'm going to go out on a limb because I didn't come into simulation as an agent-based modeling kind of guy. And
won't hold that against you.
Thank you. And so you don't kick me out right away, but I will say that, so for many years, I was interested, especially in distributed and parallel simulation, which again was very big for the Army because we have people in tanks that want to fight. And so you have a naturally distributed environment there. But saying that, I will say that many things were developed under simulation by people who didn't know anything about agents. And from my perspective, agents came along later,
right,
especially in the social sciences, health sciences. There was a discovery, I don't know if discovery is the right word. They found that simulation worked for them, and they, coming from my background, I said, that agent-based stuff looks a lot like object-oriented simulation. And so I would say that the agent-based modeling people discovered some of what they discovered perhaps was already known, but used a different language by computer scientists that did simulation. And it shouldn't be strange that if you come out of a different background, you use different terminology and different words. In fact, I found that because my computer science department came out of the math department. And we thought about simulation and computer science much differently than the computer scientists that came out of the business school, for example. And so there's some overlap between, say, object-oriented look at simulation and agent-based simulation. There are also many differences, and now I think both have something they can add to the other to help them out.
Excellent. Thank you. So, okay, so that's interesting. I've definitely seen this parallel with DoD and the sort of like more general on-call and the more general ABM. I mean, given the DoD has got a long history of using simulation, more than pretty much anybody else, and given the large budgets that the DoD has, they could choose to dominate the ABM space, right? They could have chosen to become the player that run a. Why do you think that they didn't do that? I mean, this is open to either one of you.
You want to tackle that, Matt?
Or, well, part of it, I think, stems from the discussion we just had relating to terminology. And I think it's actually some fascinating distinctions. So like Emmet was talking about agent as essentially a level of resolution. And, so I came at this, as one does from law school. But, so I think about agents from almost sort of a socio-cognitive perspective. And it's how much sort of onboard processing, so to speak, does the agent or that entity have? And if it can, sort of react to its environment and change its behavior, then I start wanting to just call it an agent rather than an entity because it has some agency to it. And then again, the verification, validation, and accreditation that we've been discussing. That, of course, also means different things in different camps. And, so there's this cultural component to it. And I mean, I don't think that can be overlooked from this notion, of why hasn't the DoD, dominated? I mean, it is the 800-pound gorilla, so to speak, in this space. And that's, largely, a lot of it, there isn't this push to publish like in an academic field where you're trying to push information out. The DoD is trying to gain information and then use it for training and things like that. And there isn't this publish or perish mentality. And so I think just over time, there hasn't been this innate need to publish and disseminate. And, we can set aside the whole classification sorts of things as well. Now, more recently, with Moores and with the Moores, conferences every summer and things, there's definitely more publication and dissemination. But again, it's still fairly insular as things go. There are specialized groups in a few universities that do attend regularly and things like that. But it's still, from a cultural perspective, I think without this innate need to push information out, it just hasn't happened as much.
Thank you both. All right, so that's good. Hopefully the audience has got this quite a nice feeling of how ABM has developed in the military domain. And obviously, we have exclusively been focusing on the DoD here, so the Department of Defense in the US. But I mean, it is the big player in the world, so I'm quite comfortable with that being the focal point. So
we brought up New Zealand.
UK as well. We've done some stuff.
Yes.
Okay, so
Have you though?
You get me in trouble. Let's shift gears. I've got a little bit of time left before we said we'd open it up to the audience. So the next question is, there has been talk about potentially some people are viewing ABM in lumping it in with large language models, which I personally don't understand, but there has been that talk. Can you talk about what you could see the large language model impact having on the ABM world, and this idea of, what's the impact maybe if it is getting lumped in with the large language model kind of arena? Have you got any views or thoughts on this at all?
So just from my thought, so there's a nice example a couple of years ago by Park et al. Was at Stanford and Google, and they had a little village, and they're using an LLM as the brains for the agents. And I forget, one of them was planning a party or a luncheon or something. And it was a really interesting use of an LLM in that space. The part of the issue, and I think Emmet will be able to talk more about this than I can. Right, it ran slower than real time, which, while perhaps not a showstopper, it doesn't help with the uptake of the LLM in this space. And so it's while LLMs are still kind of slow, in theory, you want these sorts of simulations to run faster than real time, so you can try different tactics, techniques, and procedures and see what just to harken back to what Emmet said, does this work better or worse than this? Maybe we're not saying, this is exactly what's going to happen, but we at least want to get a relative ranking here. And to the extent that the LLMs start to bog that process down, that'll start to slow their uptake. But it is really interesting. And there's been a couple of other papers that have come out of the experimental economics literature that have done a pretty nice job of showing that these LLMs can respond, at least in sort of a game theoretic setting, in a manner that's very similar to how humans work. And so I think there's definitely some promise here, but there's a bit of a there'll need to be a bit of development and maybe going from a large language model to highly specialized small language models that can run a little bit more quickly. I don't know, Emmett, what are your thoughts here?
No, I'd go along with that. I'd also say that, well, it kind of goes along with the idea of learning models too, that agent-based models are clearly made, are great for to have learning algorithms around them to figure out what they're doing and what's the best to do. I can run thousands or millions of runs and do some analysis. In the military, the problem is they want to know why. Exactly what you can't get out of the learning. That sometimes we can perhaps use the categorization or use intelligence, artificial intelligence, to help us choose to do things. But in the military, they're very reluctant to turn things over when they don't understand or can't tell you exactly what the rules are that are being followed. So if I can't use it to help explain to me why that's better or why that should be happening, so that I can then explain it to my soldiers or be part of training or whatever, the military is very reluctant to turn over to a black box command and control, making decisions. And so I think that that's part of what goes into it also, that reluctance to, I'd like to be able to use it, but I really, really, really want to know why that's happening so that I can then make more decisions or expand on that, extrapolate, and go somewhere with it.
That's a huge point. Yeah, that's a really important point. From the training and doctrine development perspective, LLMs they don't help a lot.
Well, what I learned early in training simulations is they don't have to be completely accurate or 100% truthful. I have to get the correct training results. And so sometimes I make them not honest on purpose in order to get the correct training results.
So I can imagine from what you both said, then explainable AI is going to be an important thing within the DoD. Then, from that perspective, cool, excellent. So our audience has been very good and not interrupted us once. So I did say at 10:30 we were going to open it up. I do have some further questions, but they can hold back for that. So, is there any questions from anybody in the audience? Yes, go for it, Tim.
Darn. There we go. So, hey, thanks. This is great and great discussion. So, the DoD stuff that I've done has mostly been not combat related. It seems to me that the DoD does an awful lot of stuff. Well, most of what they actually do is not fighting. It's training, but it's also eating. Making bases bigger and smaller, promoting people, making sure you have enough captains 10 years from now, and so you're doing the right thing with the rank below so that you get the right number of people there. So there's personnel stuff, there's training stuff, there's logistics, and it seems like a lot of these things involve imperfect information and tricky supply chain business. And so, could you say a little bit about non-combat uses of simulation and maybe
Sure. In fact, my first job when I got out of the Air Force was in the Air Force. It was to analyze aircraft. That was when they wanted a new transport airplane. Ended up getting the C-5. The other alternative was a 747. And one of our models was a loading model. They sent out a request for all units to measure their equipment and send in a list of their measurements. And then we had this simulation that would load it, make sure everything would go through the door and lay out. And I might say we had this problem because one unit had something that was 12 inches by 12 inches by 100 feet. And it wouldn't go through the door on the side of the 747. Well, it turned out to be fire hose. And somebody had unrolled it and measured it because they didn't know what it was. So data is always a problem. trying to get the data right. And but yes, there's I worked on a transportation model, a deployment model. Each of the ships was modeled in detail. Aircraft were kind of abstracted, but it was the purpose of the model was to say how long does it take to deploy forces to Europe for World War III, if that happened to be what it was. But that was its job, was to lay out how we would deploy forces, what would go by air, what would go by sea, where would the fast sea ships go, which ports would we use, what was the infrastructure there like, and try to optimize or speed up the deployment of the really important forces to get there. So yes, we have many, many, many other models besides combat models.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I was going to open it up to Doug and then Jacob next. So Doug, you're up.
Hello, thank you. I'm Doug Samuelson. Believe it or not, I was one of the founders of this organization. I was one of the founding officers of when it evolved from the computational and mathematical organization theory special interest group of TIMS that then became part of Informs. And in the early days of this growing agent-based group, you had to give a problem statement with enough mathematical rigor that you could explain why a mathematical analytical model wouldn't work before you started talking about agent-based simulation. By 5 years later, about 2005, I became, certainly not enjoying it, I believe the only person who ever had a contribution to a conference rejected by the organizers because I had not given any model code. I had a mathematical depiction of an organizational phenomenon that I could solve. Here's the model, here's how it works. And they said, well, you didn't show us your code, so it's not scientifically based in agent-based modeling. We're not interested. There's been this evolution in agent-based modeling, in particular the use in DoD, where 20 years ago, accreditation was a club that people used to discourage simulation. You have to prove to us that some other source of information corroborates your results. And of course, the paradox there is if you can confirm all the results of your model by some other means, the model isn't adding any information to what you know. It's useless. It's useless for analysis. It may be great for training. So we had these huge efforts in DoD to build not only models, but campaign representations and all kinds of stuff. War games in which the red team had a manual about 2 inches thick about what they were going to do, and they couldn't deviate from it. I'm sorry, this has been a very long, rambling introduction to the question. How do you see the evolution of what is considered good analysis in agent-based modeling, both in DoD and outside, and where do you think we're going?
That's a really interesting question. Emmett, I'm going to defer to you. You've got a much broader perspective about all this than I do. I'm all in on ABMs. So you'll probably be more objective because I think everything's rosy.
Right, he's exactly right. Well, that goes along with the idea that simulation is the tool of last resort. That you only do it because, well, I can't run experiments and I can't build a math model. I can't. There's something going on that I can't describe some other way to get an answer, and that has definitely changed over. I don't know I'll say over the last 20 years, but over the last 10 years, maybe better to say that, as for one thing, computers have become better. People understand them more because people deal with the technology more than they used to. Once upon a time, the people that ran the computers were in a small cell, in a room all by themselves on the hallway down there. Okay, I won't tell that story. There was a group that did analysis, and it turned out that they didn't really have any training into doing analysis, but they were really good at doing their jobs in the military, some of the best people. And so we made them analysts without giving them the tools they needed. But because they had the experience, the generals believed what these people said. And sometimes they would not be as thorough as they ought to be because they didn't have the tools that they probably should have had, or the background in doing that analysis. So there's a problem there. I think we're better at that now. I think the military brings the experts and the technicians together. Because if you're going to do a model of something, you need to understand it. But there are people that are really good at modeling that may not have the background in the discipline or the subject to make the model of it, and they need to know the experts. And then what you do is you listen for it. Yes, that's exactly what I experienced, or yes, that's the way it happens. And so that's helpful. What it doesn't do is allow you for things that are outside of the box. And that's where you need the other people that have the experience but are willing to say, what if I could do that, and I can use simulation to help me do it.
Well, if I could follow up for just a moment, I see computation getting better and better and better, and driving the uncertainty of analysis from the computation to the assumptions, where it's much harder to detect and much harder to address. Where are we going in terms of framing problems more sensibly and knowing when, in the way we framed the problem, we may have assumed an answer that we want to question?
I think that's so. Yeah, I mean that is absolutely a significant issue. So I've already hinted at this. I'm pathologically optimistic about everything, but particularly agent-based modeling. And my hope is that some of the techniques that are coming out under the moniker of inverse iterative social science will help with this. And so rather than building one fine-tuned simulation to address a problem, you're building hundreds or even thousands of models that adequately address the problem, hopefully with different underlying assumptions. And so we can start to create more robust analyses to any given assumption. But I think we're a long way off from actually getting that to fruition. But that's my hope.
There have been many attempts at in the military of saying, we're paying for all these different models and they all are addressing the same area. We really we should only have one of them. We only want to pay for one of them. So pick out the best one. And so there's this constant fight of saying, no, you really do want more than one because you want to compare what they're telling you, because each of them has their own limits. I would like to be able to say we're getting better, but I am pretty sure that there are still analysts being told, build me a model that proves this causes that, unfortunately. So it is sometimes really, really bad. We want to fund some particular thing, and I want you to show me that that's the right thing. And so build me a model that shows that this is the right thing, which is obviously the wrong question.
Yeah, we've all been there, I suspect, being asked that exact question, and it takes courage to say no, or if you're able to. Okay, so Jacob, you've been patiently waiting, so do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you for the presentation and answering our questions. I want to return to the question about neural nets, AI, and agent-based modeling. So you said that people are reluctant to hand over decision making to a black box that they can't explain, which makes total sense to me. At the same time, from my limited understanding, there's already semi-autonomous and maybe even fully autonomous weapon systems being used. So at least at a tactical level, it seems like people are willing to. I also assume these semi-autonomous systems are largely neural net based at this point, but that might be wrong. But so I'm trying to figure out this distinction. Like, is there a real distinction between strategic versus tactical decision making? Is that part of what's going on? And is part of it just that maybe these things aren't that good at strategic decision making yet, but if they were clearly better than all the humans, and I'm thinking here like, there's all these video games like StarCraft that's like a sort of like a strategy military simulator in some sense in a science fiction world, and the AIs are now better than almost every human. So I'm curious how you think that might evolve. Like at some point, are they just say, well, the AIs are better than us at strategizing, so we'll just hand it over to them?
Clearly, there has to be some weapon systems are fully autonomous. If you think of the close-in defense of a ship, the phalanx guns, you don't have time for a human to make decisions if you're trying to shoot down that missile that's coming in at more than Mach 1. So the close-in guns are completely autonomous. They have their own little radar and they track their shells and the other thing, and they direct it on. No AI involved in that as far as I know. But it needs to be autonomous because a human couldn't possibly engage the systems that it engages to protect the ship. Now, a human has to enable it, turn it on, decide when or at what level of it will be, what's the danger. You don't want it shooting down your own guys, obviously. So there is some, but once you turn it on or enable it, it's ready, and there's no human in the loop anymore. That's definitely a tactical, and now we're talking down into seconds or less than seconds of reaction time. As your time gets longer, then what you want to do becomes more flexible, and that's where it becomes a question of how to do it. The military is looking into advice, perhaps presenting alternatives. That we know the computers can help us optimize our algorithms, besides AI, and even using AI that can help us optimize what we want to do. In the simulation world, I can look at sensors perhaps that are both passive and active. But if I go active, there's a good chance that I could be attacked. So the question is, when do I go active? What's the best scheme? How many do I need? What are the things, the signals that will tell me that it's time I have to go active to look at more things? When do I use certain systems? I'd like to be able to use as cheap a weapon as I can get. Shooting down a $100,000 drone with a $50 million missile is not really cost effective if I can get at it some other way. Does that help at all?
Yeah, I just to focus it a little more, I'm curious if people are using these simulations, one usage of AI is to have the AI making decisions for the agents, but another way of using it is having the AI make strategic decisions, which is how it has been used in these video games like StarCraft. So if I'm curious if if they have been experimenting with that, but also just down the line, at some point, could it be that the AIs do start making all these strategic decisions, because when we play the war game out, they beat us every time?
Interesting. I know. So in the military, we use color codes for the forces. Like blue forces are our guys, red forces is the enemy. Sometimes we have green forces that are allied forces. The white forces are the referees or umpires. They get to change things around. I think in the simulations we'd be willing to use AI for the enemy forces more. to give our guys experience in fighting the hardest they can do. Now that's an interesting problem too. If we go back to the Iraqi war, the Iranian war, I'm sorry, go back to the Iranian war, and the question was, how hard will they fight? If I'm simulating it to figure out how much ammo I need, how many units, whatever, I want to calculate it, analyze it. If they fight as well as they can, what will happen? Now, if they don't fight that hard, that's great. So that's really a roundabout way. There's still a reluctance to say, I'm going to let AI run my forces or tell me how to go directly. I might use it for advice, ideas, options, but I'm reluctant to let them have complete control. And something like StarCraft, that's a fast time. You have to react quickly. And I've seen those results, and I said, well, I can't do it that fast. There's no way a human knows to look in all those places, and so trying to fight the computer and the AI, they've learned what works really well to optimize the kinds of forces they have. I can't, even if I knew that after doing it, I'm not able to do it as a human operator as fast as they can.
Thank you very much. Cool. So Claudio has been patiently waiting for a question and also put some comments in the chat. So Claudio, over to you.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Good, thank you.
Hi, Claudio.
I want to start by saying that thank the CSSSA for hosting this talk and continuing the 20+ year tradition of computational social science. Much appreciated, and I really like this format. You had asked before to have some feedback on that. I think this definitely is very functional and very, very informative and very stimulating. And it's also good to see some new names I have not met, but I really appreciate all the participation. I have a question, but before I forget, given the nature of this discussion, I wanted to point out that next Monday, this coming Monday, at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, there is a Zoom talk very much like this with two individuals discussing and so forth on the topic of how AI is facilitating new mathematical research. Now, some of that discussion will be about pure mathematics, but a good deal of it, I suspect, will also be about applied mathematics. And from mathematicians' point of view, agent-based modeling is another branch of applied mathematics, as some of you know. So I think that talk might be quite stimulating and of great interest to the questions that we're exploring here.
Click on the link in the chat, if you don't mind, Claudio.
Yeah, it's sponsored by the Association of Mathematical Research. And if there's interest in that, I can I don't know if this is an open talk or not. I don't know if it's only for members or not. I just got a notice the other day. If there's interest in that, I can try and get a link to be able to zoom in and distribute it through the CSSSA channel. I think that would be fun. My question I have is, the other day, I was reading a very interesting report on an issue that is, I would say, tangential and secondary to our concerns in agent-based modeling, but instructive, I think, in some regards. And this was a report about what happened in the U.S. Air Force Academy a few years ago when some of the faculty in the Department of Mathematics realized that the curriculum they had in the teaching of applied calculus, the main calculus applied sequence, was woefully out of date. And so they undertook a big project to overhaul and update and modernize the teaching of applied calculus at the Academy. And as you know, the U.S. Air Force Academy has always had a very leading role in the teaching of mathematical methods in an applied context. Perhaps without offending anyone, perhaps more so than some of the other academies. So my question is this. Those of you who may have closer knowledge to the teaching of computer science and specifically applied computational science, under which ADM falls, the teaching of the subject at the military academies, have they done something comparable to this modernization and overhauling? Because obviously, an up-to-date, really contemporary course in computational science should include at the military academies should include military applications of simulation, as I'm sure it does. But is some specific attention being paid to agent-based modeling as opposed to other forms of simulation?
I have sort of anecdotal evidence I could throw at that. The Naval Postgraduate School has their MOVES Institute and the SEEDS Lab, both of which do a lot of work in national security simulations. That's mostly the MOVES Institute. And then the SEEDS Lab, an awful lot on design of experiments for vast parameter space searches and things like that. I know that this was like 10 years ago now, maybe longer. West Point was thinking very hard about this, and they had a summer program where cadets would essentially do computational history and build agent-based models of famous battles and, try to understand the sensitivities, thereof. And they also had at least an experimental seminar on agent-based modeling specifically. Emmet, you probably have a lot more experience here than I do.
I don't for the academy, the Air Force Academy in particular, and I ought to. I sense that as a lack. I'll try to find out and let you know what I find out.
Okay, thank you all. So we're getting pretty close to the 11 o'clock timeline. So I would like to finish up on one question, which is, I think this is more targeted to Matt than Emmet, but just to ask. So what do you guys see the relationship between Computational Social Science Society of America and the DoD? What do you see that kind of relationship? How do you see that evolving over the time? Obviously, you're involved. So.
It's so tight, it's hard to imagine. No, there are definitely pockets that pay attention to each other. I can't, at least I certainly can't claim that there's a really strong coupling between sort of computational social science in the national security arena and the CSSSA specifically. But there is growing awareness. There are, more and more folks in this space going through academic programs. Mason has a pretty active program that definitely has folks in this space going through it. And being completely self-serving here, I would certainly encourage anybody in the national security arena that is interested in these sorts of topics and applications thereof, to be an active member of the CSSSA. Join us. Emmet, you'd probably be a little more objective.
I'd go along with that. I'd say up until very recently, most of the actual work, technical coding, is not done by the military. It's done by contractors to do that. So that it's only very recent that the analysis agency, or at least the one I'm familiar with, which is the Center for Army Analysis, which is just down the road from me, their people have started to do their own code, and so there's a chance of picking up people who might have that background. Otherwise, it's through contractors, and a lot of times they don't have the familiarity.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed this format. I felt this went really well. Thank you very much to Matt and Emmet